Welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm Arwel Jones from the Respiratory Research Alfred Research Group at Central Clinical School. Sorry, I can't even speak at the start of this webinar. I'm also a member of the Community and Researcher Engagement Committee within the Central Clinical School. I'm one of your hosts today and facilitates for the session. Before we begin, and I also pass over to Patricia, who's also one of the facilitators today, I just wanted to acknowledgement to country. And we acknowledge the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri clans of the Kulin nations, are the custodians of the lands in which we host this meeting from today, and pay our respects to elders past and present. And I'll also extend this traditional of lands of wherever you are joining to this meeting today. So Patricia, I just want to pass over to you for your introduction, and I'll stop sharing this slide.
Yeah, my name is Patricia Sarmiento. I'm the co-host of this meeting, and I'm part of the capacity building group within the CaRE committee. Personally, I'm an architect originally from Barcelona. I'm not part of the medical community. However, I do consider myself to be a contributor to it because I have a syndrome called visual snow. And so I'm really passionate about advocating about my syndrome and just making sure that I shed some light on the importance about, consumer and researcher engagement.
Thank you, Patricia. And before we hand over to our panelists that we've convened for today's webinar, I'll just go through some housekeeping. This session is being recorded. So for those who are unable to join us live today, hopefully you'll be able to catch up on this and watch this recording. This really is quite an informal and open forum and a Q&A. So feel free to use the Q&A and the chat function to post your questions, and we'll look to tend to those throughout the webinar today. We do have, let's say, some set questions to facilitate the session to ask the panelists, but of course we can attend to any of your questions as we go through where they are relevant. In terms of anything else, everything else really is open in terms of the questions. The only thing I might say is you can't really bring up or comment on anything related to the football matches that took part in the World Cup today. Reasons, okay, that's a strict permitted rule for not to engage in anything like that. But in terms of the session, of course, what we're trying to do with this webinar is to build capacity within CCS of having consumers and researchers working together in their research programs. One way in which we could do this, of course, is to convene a panel who are doing this already and are doing it very well. Without further ado, what I want to do now is kind of go through our panelists so they can introduce themselves, and they'll do a much better job introducing themselves than I would do. If we can start off with, I guess, who I can see first on my screen here, and if we start off with Anna, please.
Thank you very much, Arwel and Patricia. And good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for this opportunity. Like Patricia, I'm part of the CaRE committee as a consumer advocate. I'd also like to acknowledge I'm on Gubbi Gubbi country, and I'm very thankful to say that is the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. So, late of Melbourne. So I'd like to start just a quick introduction. Yeah, I'm very active consumer advocate at the Centre for Blood Diseases, but also at WeHi, Peter Mac, Cancer Council Victoria, New South Wales, the VCCC, Monash. I've been a grant reviewer at the VCA and the Consumer Council, the Cancer Council, sorry. Where else? Several other organisations. Professionally, I run, I guess, a related organisation called Women in Lymphoma that you may have heard of. It's a professional global alliance for predominantly women, but we have a number of male members as well, who are clinicians, researchers and educators in the specialised field of lymphoma. So we run webinars and all sorts of other things, and it's for education and the furthering of leadership of women in the field. What else is there? I'm also studying at University of Sunshine Coast. So I'm on summer holidays right now, and I'm very active with cycling and water sports and other things. And I guess what brought me to all of this was a diagnosis when I was living overseas with a rare, incurable and chronic blood cancer called polycythemia vera. So I've been living very strongly and determinedly for 14 years, more than 14 years with that. And I think part of the positivity that comes from advocacy offsets any of the maybe negative sides of living with a chronic illness and being able to contribute and further things. I'm particularly interested in research, obviously in my own blood cancer, but all of them, but with research and the grant application process, both sides. So I say I'm fairly well experienced with the applications and reviewing. So thank you all.
Thanks, Anna. Over to you, Christoph.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Christoph Hagemeyer. I'm a researcher here at the Australian Centre for Blood Diseases within the Central Clinical School. My lab is working on cardiovascular disease, particularly the diagnosis and early detection of the disease, and also better therapies to treat vessel occlusion, heart attacks, and strokes. My colleague and close collaborator, Karen Alt, was one of the co-founders and co-chairs of the CaRE committee. So basically that's how it all started, that she asked me if I would be interested to be matched with a consumer, and I said yes, let's give that a go in a way, and then I was matched with Pete. COVID was not very helpful to get that off the ground, because we had planned many times a visit and see each other in person, but that was all then cancelled and postponed. But Pete kindly agreed to look at our grants and get involved in some of the research we were doing, and agreed then also to be an associate investigator on some of our grants. And I basically sent him the proposals and asked him, what you think about that? Would be something useful that you would like to see in your situation, and would be helpful for your outcome, or what you want to know about your disease, basically. And then finally, a few weeks ago, we managed to actually get together in person, which was great. So he came out. He lives a bit further away from Melbourne, so he came out, and we organized a seminar where our PhD students presented, and we had a tour of our imaging facility and had lunch together. So that was really exciting and really great, and hopefully we can build from there and really grow this relationship further. Thank you.
Thanks, Christoph. And over to you, Pete.
Yeah, so my name is Pete. I'm the consumer, if you like, and I've been partnered with Christoph. I suppose my journey started, I was diagnosed with polycythemia vera, similar to Anna, about 7 years ago, and at the age of 45. And through various polycythemia online groups, I was connected with this CaRE partnership, and I thought, one thing I've learned as a consumer is to be an advocate and to get involved. So I thought, well, this might be a great opportunity to do that. So I did register, and then I was actually partnered with Christoph, because not long after being diagnosed with polycythemia, I was also, it took quite a little while, and the journey was long, but I also had cardiovascular disease. So on one hand, I had quite a rare disease with polycythemia, but then on the other hand, only 18 months later, I was in the Alfred Hospital and had a stent put in, because I had quite a common disease, and that's the cardiovascular or the heart disease. So partnered with Christoph and got interested, and thought, well, part of being an advocate and being on my own journey was also to get involved and find out what's happening in areas that could help me out in the future. So that's why, getting partnered with Christoph has been a huge bonus. It's been a privilege to be able to go down and be involved and have the tour with Karen. It was fantastic. And as a consumer, you do want to see what's happening, and you want to understand, the treatments for polycythemia have been the same treatments for decades. there are some new drugs coming on, but the treatment for cardiovascular disease has not been much different either. So to find out, what's new and what's out there is quite exciting, and to actually get involved is a real privilege. So thank you.
Thank you, Pete. And over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Arwel. There is another World Cup in 4 years, so moving on. My name's Anne Holland. I am Professor of Physiotherapy. I am also in the Central Clinical School. I'm Head of Respiratory Research across Central Clinical School, Monash and Alfred. And I guess the reason I'm here today is that I've had a number of different experiences around consumer engagement in research. I'm a clinical trialist, so I've had quite a bit of involvement with consumers at sort of all phases of clinical trials, through from development to translation. I also sit on lots of different grant review panels, including NH and MRC and MRFF, and as many people here will know, consumer engagement is becoming increasingly important in how we score grants. And I also lead consumer engagement for the Centre of Research Excellence in Pulmonary Fibrosis, which is an NH and MRC funded centre. And in that capacity, I've been involved with developing a number of different strategies, including a research priority setting exercise, which involved over 500 consumers, setting up a consumer advisory panel for our clinical trials network, and involving consumers in research translation.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to everybody for taking the time to be here as a panel member today. And hopefully that to everybody else gives a reflection of what we're trying to do with the session. Really is a mix of consumer advocates and consumers with researchers to try to build capacity within CCS. And of course, the CaRE program was co-founded by Karen Alton, Catherine Carmichael. And one active area for us at the moment is building capacity, and of course on the topic today of grant applications and how can we facilitate mutually beneficial, but also of course meaningful connections between consumers and researchers to, I guess, achieve grant success or at least development in research. So I'll pass over to Patricia for the first question that we have, but I guess before that, I think there's been some issues with the chat function that people can't add in their departments from CCS or Monash or whichever other institution that you join in from. If you could try doing it in the Q&A instead, and we'll look to capture the information from there. And again, just for your benefit, I guess, but also to ease any concerns, we're no watchdog. We've not been told, who's joining. It's more or less just to get a sense of what reach have we got today, and where can we look elsewhere to kind of engage other institutions and partners within Alfred Health and so on. Over to you, Patricia.
Thanks, Arwel. I guess we'll start with the first question. What are grant reviewers looking for in terms of consumer engagement? We'll probably direct the question to Christoph to start with, and then we'll probably run through other panelists.
Sorry, unmute. So I think for the grant reviewer, I haven't really reviewed grants where consumer advocacy is a big part. So that's usually in the MRFF or in other organizations. The NHMRC is not mandating it at the moment, but we still put it in. I think what I would look at as a reviewer is really that it's a genuine connection, that it's not like copy and paste parts, generic formulations. And I try to really convey that in my grants by citing Pete straight away. I think we had discussions about some of the projects we submitted, and I asked him, would something like this be useful for you, or you think that would be valuable? And he said, oh, yeah, it would be great to have my disease diagnosed earlier or more accurate or things like that. And then I put this kind of things in as a citation for him with his approval, of course. And I think that's hopefully conveying to the reviewer that there's a real interaction and a real working relationship between the advocate and the researcher. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, that it's not coming across as tagged on or something which is just not genuine. Yeah.
And what do you think, Anne?
I think the reviewers are looking for what the peer review guidelines tell them to look for. So they have to score according to the guidelines. So before I came on today, I got out the criteria for the recent NHMRC clinical trials round, which closed a couple of months back. And I'm going to read it to you. And this is a 7. It's in significance, which is 40% of the score. And 2 of the criteria are in there. And there's only 5 criteria. 2 of them are these. The proposal is strongly developed with extremely broad and meaningful community involvement, ensuring the proposal is extremely feasible. And consumer representation is fully integrated into all aspects of the planning, conduct, publication and translation of the project. So if you want a 7, that's what you have to do to get one from the reviewers. So I think that's probably the most important thing for these types of schemes, is actually look at what's in the guidelines and write to that. Of course, that means you have to have evidence of those things, and you can't develop that in 2 days. So this is a process that starts a long time beforehand. But think about what's in the peer review guidelines. I think is probably the first piece of advice, and write to that.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to think broadly in terms of who is a consumer. So a consumer might be somebody living with a health condition that you're doing research in, but a consumer might also be a patient advocacy body. It might be a policymaker. It might be people who you want to deliver this treatment. So I think it's also important to think about broadly who the consumers of this piece of research are going to be, and write to that as well. So don't lock yourself into thinking about one type of consumer. And I think I would also say that not all of the consumer engagement work needs to be yours. So, for instance, if somebody has done a research priority setting exercise in the group of people in whom you're applying this treatment, and you hit those research priorities that have been developed, globally by people from, in my context, people living with pulmonary fibrosis, for instance, then you can use that piece of research to say, this is research that consumers want. So I think also that types of work that other people have done to pull in, that can be the same with things like, where you've got other qualitative studies or interviews or things like that you can pull in, but then also you have to demonstrate your own involvement and engagement across the research process. And I think it's pretty easy to tell when you read a grant whether the consumer was shown it at the end or whether they had involvement through the start, because it does change the language in the way that the grant is written.
Thanks, Anne. Was there anything else, Anna, that you wanted to contribute to the question?
I would follow on from Anne. Absolutely, the depth of engagement is crucial. I'd also say that broad definition of consumer can include carers as well, and they very often have a very close experience with the disease or issue that's in question. I would say, just be authentic. Allow plenty of time to develop this relationship and have conversations, not that tick box and rush at the end. Oh gosh, that's right, I need to include somebody, grab somebody. I've seen it myself in reviews, and it actually, the science can be there for every single one of them, and it can come down to the language in the application, how the clarity, things like that, but it can also come down to consumer engagement. And if you have 1 or 2 people or 3 or 4, if they have related, if it's about heart disease, is everybody, is connected with cancer? Really the relevance, the authenticity of it is so important, and also showing a timeline of engagement. So for instance, actually, citing dates, or saying you have a catch up every quarter, or project updates, all that kind of thing. Lab tours are very, very positive, and whether it's in person or walking around with your telephone on Zoom. All this kind of engagement, it's authentic. It's not just to tick the boxes, oh yes, I've done that. But you actually engage a consumer and you in an understanding of what your project is about, because then we become your cheer squad. We understand why you're doing what you're doing, and we can see why you're doing it. And it shows, it really does show. And I've seen grant applications come down to, oh, well, they only had one consumer. It doesn't look like they really had much contact. And they had the science there. So it can't be underestimated. Obviously, the weighting tells you so much, and it's been growing almost yearly with every organization. So that tells you a lot as well. It's not a PS to your application. It's not something to kind of, oh, well, I'll deal with that later. Give it the, and I'm not saying it because I'm a consumer, give it the time and the depth that it absolutely demands. And it benefits all the research so much as well. I remember one of the first times I engaged with a researcher, Peter Mack, and she said, like, literally, how do you find people? Do you go downstairs to Cafe 8 and say, anyone got a blood cancer? You know, so finding consumers, and here you are with this setup to guide you through this. Use that, use the framework, and the you know, the support, the training, and the experience that's there. You're not on your own trying to establish this. So there's so much you can do, but I would, you know, underscore that you can't leave it to the last minute or leave it as some kind of last section that can just be rushed through a bit later. It you know, it merits the attention and everything for the benefit of your research, and also ongoing, with or without the grant. We meet and get updates and across it all. It's really important just to continue to nurture the relationship and the engagement. Thank you.
And I guess just to emphasize the point, really, I think the grant applications is quite topical. This week we've received deadlines for the 2023 of when the major funders are. So I guess if anybody is online and you're considering on involving consumers, hopefully, and engaging consumers, is probably start very soon, because of course those grant applications go by very, very quickly. So we'd encourage you to really engage and involve people as soon as you can, and there's really no sooner time to do that. And I guess just on that, Pete and Anna, did you have any thoughts on, let's say, from your perspective, when is a good time? How much time would you usually want before you actually consider whether to be involved in a grant application, let's say?
I suppose for me, I work shift work and I've got a family and stuff, but so, it's important that I find the time and I set aside the time for this, because I am passionate about getting involved and being an advocate. The amount of time, it really, you can't put a time on that, but I'd love to be able to catch up with Christoph maybe quarterly and try and get down to visit. And as far as the grant applications, in the process, if I'm reading them and trying to understand them and, finding out what is it I can contribute. So sometimes it's, as a consumer, I'm not too sure exactly what it is. Is it my story, or is it my journey, or is it a statement I can make, or is it, getting in contact with boards or whatever? I'm not sure. So the earliest I can be involved, the better, and the clearer the picture of the expectation as a consumer. And I've had that conversation with Christoph, and that's great. So the earlier the expectation of what they would like from me, the better. So I'd like to be involved as early as possible. Yeah.
I think it depends a little bit also what area of research. I think the basic research, it's much harder to make the pitch and to have someone really involved. Sometimes then for the clinical trial, I see your point and about the guidelines, but I think to have someone involved in every aspect is probably a bit challenging at the start of the translational pipeline and easier at the end of the translational pipeline. But I think at the end of the translational pipeline, what I really want to understand is that patients, let's say for cardiovascular disease, do you mind if a scan is half an hour or 5 minutes? Is that something you would really consider, or having a stent put in, or rather taking a drug? Is that something you would really, what would you prefer? I think things like that. I think that's something which is really important to understand as a researcher when you're developing products for the translational pipeline. Yeah. And I think that has been really valuable for us. One thing, so just quickly, Bridget had a question. I'm not sure if you saw that, because that's something I always wondered as well, because you were telling about one versus many. So I have one consumer at the moment, and I think I would rather build this relationship and put that to more depths than having 5 or 10. Yeah, I think, and also for the CARE program, can the CARE program provide group of consumers and match them with a researcher, or only just one? So I'm really interested in the view of the panel. What's the best strategy? And Bridget posted that as well. Maybe
it seems
10.
that a lot of institutions, 3 is a good number, not too few, not too many. And as I said, when it really comes down to the line for the finalists, that can be one of the things that's pointed out, one consumer with superficial engagement. I've heard that comment on several of the review panels. So, yes, it would depend on the kind of research as well. But it's bringing a human aspect, and also the variety of consumers, like Anne said, a carer, a patient, somebody in policy making, if it's, not a conflict of interest or whatever, as well, because perhaps 3 patients with identical diagnosis may not necessarily be beneficial, because they may share a very similar experience and journey. So it could be really goes case by case, but I would say more than 3 could be really not necessary, from what I've seen in the reviews and the comments, and generally what the norm is with the dozens that I'm either have been or am engaged with at the moment.
I might bring a slightly different perspective, I guess. I think it depends on what they're there for. So I think if you're talking about naming a consumer on the grant, I think, small numbers of consumers is fine, because you can't name large numbers of people. I mean, I guess for us in respiratory disease, particularly in a disease like idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, where the prognosis is terrible and the disability is high, we would try not to just name one person, because actually people get sick and they die. So, sharing the load, I think, across numbers of consumers is in my view, for that group, a more reasonable approach than to try and put it all on one person. But just as an example, for a recent clinical trial grant, we had done a series of 5 online workshops with people living with disease, which in this case is cystic fibrosis. So that actually involved very large numbers of consumers, but they weren't all named on the grant. We certainly talked about how many there were and their backgrounds and all those sorts of things. But in terms of naming people on the grant, we named 2 investigators who were consumers on the grant, and that was people living with the disease. Plus, we also named people who worked for patient advocacy organisations, etc. as well. So I think it's about thinking about why that consumer is there and what you're trying to demonstrate. Are you trying to demonstrate broad engagement across the community that's informed your proposal and your design or whatever, or your understanding of the importance of the research question, etc.? Or is it around having somebody who you're saying, this person is going to sit on our steering committee, they're going to partner with one of the researchers to lead the translation strategy, those sorts of things. So it's, why is that person there? I guess that ties back to the meaningful engagement. Why are you doing this? What's their role? How are they going to be engaged in the project going forwards, and being able to articulate that? So I don't think it's a numbers game, actually. I think it's around that meaningful kind of engagement and having a purpose to it.
And just to follow on Christoph's question and query about the CARE program, essentially the support that we can provide can be tailored to according to what the researchers or the consumers would like in the context of the research program. Of course, I think at the moment the most common thing is perhaps a consumer expresses interest in the CARE program. We find a connection between them and then a researcher within CCS, or vice versa. Maybe a CCS researcher comes to us, and then we find a consumer who can support them. But at the same time, of course, that's what we're seeing at the moment. Doesn't mean that's the only thing. So we can certainly tailor it according to whether it's one or a group of consumers. There's also a question in the Q&A which is related to this, and I guess it's somewhat related to HMRC funding in particular. What are the panel members' thoughts on people with a lived experience being chief investigators and/or associate investigators, and the issue of trying to capture their expertise relative to the grant in a grant system such as CCS that does not embrace lived experience as a form of essential expertise? So I will pass over to Anne first, perhaps, and then, but of course, everyone feel free to interject any point.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I think it's very easy for an associate investigator in the NHMRC system. You don't always have AIs in that MRFF system, but it's usually pretty easy because you've got just a character limit, which is usually pretty short, to talk about that person's skills and experience and what they're bringing to the grant. So I think that's really easy. CIs, I think it's very powerful to have consumers as CIs, absolutely, but I take the point that Sapphire is kind of not set up in that way to really reflect their expertise in the way that we write track records, etc. I've certainly seen it done. I would say that if you have a consumer as a CI, you are so much closer to getting that 7 that I talked about before. Like, that is a really powerful statement that actually this is really key to your grant, engaging with consumers. So yes, it takes a bit of thought and wordsmithing to think about how you can write a 1 or 2 page track record for a consumer, but it can be done. And I would probably worry about it less, in the sense that there are very easy ways for your score to be bumped up now because of meaningful consumer engagement. And that's a really great way to show it, I think. I've previously sat on a CRE panel when we used to do interviews, and the teams that walked into the room, you could only, I think, bring 5 people or 4 people to interview. The teams that walked into the room and one of those people was a consumer, they were up. So, yeah.
Christoph, do you have any further thoughts on that in respect to perhaps, you know, your previous applications that you've done where Pete was involved too?
Yeah, so Pete was, as I said, an AI on one of the MRFF and 2 of the NHMRC grants. I haven't really thought about CI role for the reasons you mentioned, and that it's like you have to have much more paperwork and the CV and everything, and fill out the entire profile on Sapphire. And I'm not sure for some of the more basic stuff we are doing if that's really necessary. I think an AI role is probably appropriate. But for the centers of excellence or clinical trials, I think it would be definitely great to have a CI on the grant. Yeah.
Can I just say that if you are going to do either CI or AI for a consumer, they still have to grapple with Sapphire, and we all hate it. And consumers often really, really struggle with it. So you have to support that appropriately. You essentially have to allocate a person to help them to get their information in, because even as an AI, they have to accept a Sapphire invitation these days, and that can be really tricky.
Yeah.
We've naturally gone into the second main question that we had today, which was around you know, what's considered to be a valuable consumer, if you like, from a grant perspective. If I start off, I guess, just to the rest of the discussion in this section, Pete and Anna, I guess from your point of view, what support or expectations might you have as a consumer from being involved in, let's say, a grant application? Anna, if you want to perhaps start us.
Thank you. As far as support goes, I mean, in an organization like ACBD, obviously we have that. I've been a consumer for many years, where it was very DIY and meeting in a cafe and will you be a consumer and what does that mean? But I think you can navigate it together, and it really is about being informed, staying in touch, keeping consistency, and updating on projects, not, oh, last year I actually got a grant, you know, like kind of making the consumer feel engaged and part of it. Explaining any science that needs explaining. I mean, we as consumers don't need to know or understand everything. And I think that's where some consumers worry that, well, I don't understand all of that. And that's really not such a big issue. It's very interesting if you're interested to learn more. And I think preferably, you know, reaching out for consumers that perhaps have been engaged in other research projects or have a framework like with the CARE committee to support and guide and give some ideas on what to do. And I guess as well, the research is, when they keep in touch, is ask questions. Do you need to know something? Do you feel supported? Have we missed anything? Or, you know, and each project is different. You could be a consumer 25 times, but each one is different. So, and leaving, I think as well, it sounds small, but at the beginning or end of what's usually a Zoom session, just a social chat about where you live or what you like doing or whatever. So the team feels connected, and it might say they're, you know, moving house or expecting a child or taking on another project or moved into another lab. All of this is interesting and important for everybody, I think. And then likewise for the consumer, as far as their health goes, if they feel comfortable sharing all of that. So yeah, I guess the consistency and authentic relationship builds like that in different ways. And if you don't meet for 6 months or something, then you kind of drop the thread there. For me, I think it's very important on all projects, small and large, to just keep conversations going, drop a quick email. Oh, there's this, you know, I published a paper. It might be slightly unrelated, but, you know, just getting to know each other more, that kind of thing, feeling supported, definitely.
Thanks, Anna. And Pete, have you got any further thoughts on that, and what support you might like from the point of being involved as a consumer in a grant application?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose I always thought, you know, what support can I give? And I never thought of the, you know, what support can I get? But Christoph and I have been building a great relationship over the last, you know, 18 months. And on reading the grant applications and trying to understand and learn, you know, what the aim is. And Christoph has been available. And I suppose the issues for us has probably just been distance. You know, I live a couple of hours away, and I would like to get down more often, but you know, sometimes it's just an email or you know, even a Zoom catch up, and you know, I think we can, you know, move forward on those things, and I can get more involved. But you know, the support and understanding of what Christoph and his team are trying to achieve is really important, and that's something that we're going to work on and go forward with. And yeah, I sort of looked at it as what support I can give, you know.
On a similar vein, there is a question in the Q&A, where is it, which relates to, I guess, training. And from let's say, you know, a new relationship or a new partnership with a consumer, from all panel members, are you aware of any specific training for consumers in research?
Yes, I've had training at several organisations like WeHi and Peter Mac and Cancer Voices New South Wales and other places. And certainly as a reviewer, I guess we're briefed pretty comprehensively about what is expected and you know, what you're looking for or what you need to look past, maybe the scientific side of it or something like that. But I did see Deb's comment and wonder if that's available to people outside WA, because I think, you know, ongoing learning is always very, very important. It's not once learnt and then you're on board. Because the landscape of the grant application process, the weighting of consumer engagement, all of it is dynamic. And I think consumers can and should be also and continue to learn. So, you know, if there's any other training I haven't done, I'll sign up for sure.
I think there's some good training packages out there for consumers being involved in research. And ACTA, the Clinical Trials Alliance, has some. I think the VCCC has some really good ones as well. I think Telethon Kids also provides some. But I think there's almost always a need for some sort of specific training around the activities that you're undertaking. So as Anna said, you know, for grant assessment, for instance, you know, there's often sort of specific training around what you're looking for, you know, what the criteria is, what the context of this grant round is, you know, what are the aims, you know, what does the funder want to fund here? What's the way in which it's assessed? How do the consumer scores play into the, you know, overall score, those sorts of things. So I think a combination of the two things is good. Some, you know, sort of background training around research and research engagement, but also some specific training around the specific tasks or responsibilities of that role is helpful.
And I guess it just goes back to the previous discussions around time. And of course, you know, one benefit, of course, of involving and engaging consumers earlier on is to avoid this kind of tokenistic approach of, you know, involving them too late. But of course, at the same time, if we have consumers who perhaps require some training or some advice, all of these things are going to take time. So it's not going to work if we do try to do this too late on. One question I've also got here is around authenticity and how best to demonstrate that in terms of relationship in the grant application. We kind of spoke a bit about, Christoph, you mentioned Pete within the application itself, or is there any other further thoughts on how you can really demonstrate that within a grant application? And maybe from your own experience to begin with, how might you, you know, have this to stand out really, or even from your experience as a panel member?
Yeah, I think being as specific as you can. So if you ran a series of consumer workshops, say in January 2022, we ran 5 consumer workshops, which involved X number of people, you know, so it's a real thing, not just a sort of nebulous engagement exercise. You know, our research team, you know, developed this proposal, you know, and our research team includes consumers, AI, this and AI that, you know, so you're really naming people all the way through the grant, you're making it clear when the activities happened, linking to organisations as well. So linking to CARE, for instance, is one of the ways that you could do it. You know, we have a strong relationship with CARE and, you know, engage consumers, you know, through this mechanism and, you know, have a regular series of visits, et cetera, et cetera. So for us, we will often say in our grants, you know, this proposal has been reviewed and approved by the Consumer Advisory Group for the Pulmonary Fibrosis Clinical Trials Network, you know, on blah date in 2022, those sorts of things. So you're really trying to be very specific around when those activities happened and what they were for, I guess. Not just, you know, kind of this grant has, you know, been reviewed by consumers who said it was really important. Yeah.
And Anna, have you got any further thoughts on that? From your kind of...
Yeah, just going back to the timeline thing, my one thought is, in my experience, actually a lot of organizations with their grant office will actually just say no if the researcher leaves it too late. I'm not going to find you a consumer. That's what happens. So don't put yourself in that position, basically. It's like, you know, leaving your study to the night before the exam. It just doesn't end well. And if you've done all this work in the lab and all these months and years to get to that and miss a grant deadline, and also as a consumer, when we're committed to other things within this space and, you know, work and life and everything else, the more inclined to say, no, I can't help you because I've got other commitments. And the first question I always ask, is, you know, different applications have different deadlines, is when is this due in your organization? Not at NHMRC or whatever, because, you know, WEHI or PDMAC or ACBD might have different deadlines to bring it to them to review and fine tune. And if it's not at least 6-8 weeks, I'd say, at least, then, and it's not like, oh, I pick and choose what and all that. It's not about me, but I can't see that the researcher would really have authentic engagement and also have enough time to then to and fro a bit with documents. And as well, and I've found in many organizations, and I say this as a multilingual person, when English isn't the first language and the grant is written and it needs a lot more reviewing and time. So it's often why I'm asked, because I speak other languages and can see why the grammar is that way, particularly from Asian languages. So, you know, and that's just something that can take more time. It can't be left. And if it looks like Google Translate, it's not going past. So that's another thing that really, you've got to respect the work, respect the process, 100%, and everyone involved in it.
I think the other thing as a researcher is we need to sort of modify our expectations around how those relationships work as well, because I think, you know, as researchers, we're used to very transactional conversations. You know, you have a Zoom meeting, you go to the business, you get it done, you know, you pick up the phone, you ring someone, you want an answer that's quickly given to you in 5 minutes. And that is not how these relationships work. You know, they are often quite, you know, long conversations on the phone, because you're trying to develop a relationship and you're trying to provide context and you're trying to, you know, work out how you can facilitate that meaningful contribution and make that person feel supported to give that contribution. So I think for researchers, we also have to change the way we interact as well. It's not the same as interacting with another bunch of researchers or a bunch of clinicians for me or anything like that. It's a very different way of operating, and you kind of need to leave yourself time both to learn that, but also to engage in that process, because it does require time commitment.
Christoph and Peter, you're one of our real success stories from the CaRE program. You've established a, you know, really effective and a partnership, and we've heard some of your thoughts on that today so far. For those who are perhaps new to consumer involvement, community involvement, how would you say that the CaRE program has supported you in your, you know, development of your partnership, but also, I guess, reflecting back on when you first started, what, you know, were each of you really looking for from that partnership to begin with?
The CaRE program was, of course, essential to get that off the ground. I think I wouldn't, because I'm not so much in the MRFF translational end space where it's now very much required. For us, it's more really something we got into probably earlier than other groups in the country, which is great, of course, because it will come and be mandatory in the future. I'm pretty sure about that around NHMSC and more of the fundamental science as well. And yeah, I think CaRE was great. I think they provided a lot of training and also support. Also, what's good, we have like an internal logbook, so to say, where we kind of write down what we have done, how often we have reached out to the consumer. That's something which really helps you to keep track of the interaction as well, and really try to have some regularity in the interaction. So that's really I think great. Yeah. So CaRE has been really good to support that.
And I think, you know, when you ask for a consumer, you could end up with someone like me that doesn't have the medical background or the involvement with the groups. You're just going to get someone that has a disease or two, and they just want to be an advocate and be involved. So the CaRE partnership has been able to provide me with that support, and then that, you know, relationship building with Christoph. Like, I'd never be able to talk to somebody like Christoph if it wasn't for the program. So that's amazing. And I suppose, you know, when you ask for a consumer, you're going to get somebody from all different walks of life, and you have to work with that and build that relationship. And, you know, I've been fortunate that I've had someone like Christoph to you know, to move that along and educate me, and that's been valuable. Yeah,
it's a challenge, of course, to really present your research in a very easy to understand manner. I think for us as scientists, that's something which is highly valuable, that we learn how to present. And I thought that because when we had the symposium for Pete the other day, I told my students, really try to make that very visual, have really diagrams and schemes and things like that, so it's easy to understand. And I think Pete really enjoyed, I hope, the presentations and everything we presented. But I think, yeah, for us, it's really easy to write complicated grants, but to really have that in a very easy to understand manner it's quite challenging, and it's quite good to do that and be asked to do that.
Well, absolutely. In the grants, when you need to do the plain English summary, I mean, it's actually, it's on a plate for you to have consumers to read it through. And quite often the policy is, can the consumer explain it to somebody else quite simply?
Yeah.
You know, the elevator pitch, that kind of thing. So I think that part of it is actually to the advantage if you have a setup like the CARE committee, because they're helping you get through that step and, you know, be able to produce the plain English summary that's required without, you know, and you have a channel to sort of test it out first and see if people can explain it to each other, that kind of thing, definitely. And there was just that Christoph's previous point, I'm just trying to remember, I think I lost the thread, about the training and the committee, sorry. I'll try and think, but I might pop it in the chat.
No, I can remember my very first pitch to a consumer on my research, and they got absolutely ripped apart. So it's very worthwhile to involve them in that, because they're the best to be able to convey that. Because I think in terms of trying to understand the research from a scientific point of view, we're very well versed in that and trying to write that to convince other scientists perhaps. But I think if I try to disseminate to the public, there's no better way to do it from my perspective, at least, than involving a consumer to do that.
Well, there's certainly, sorry, in the review panels, lay people and medical specialists in other fields that could be completely unrelated. So don't ever assume that everyone reading the blood cancer research knows a lot about blood cancer. You know, it's that simple. I think, and the other last point I want to make is, as a researcher, is to take charge of this team. And that I've seen in the past, not here, but elsewhere, where perhaps a consumer might feel it's an opportunity to ask, you know, individual questions about the diagnosis or whatever. So I think you have to step up and say, you know, run the agenda of the team and keep it on track. And you know, whether they're inexperienced or recently diagnosed or wherever they sort of come in from. As a researcher, it's very important to keep it, you know, on track and hold the team together as well. But I wouldn't say that's a daunting task. I think that's, you know, benefits your research in the long term and your grant applications.
And Patricia, we've got one, let's say, a final question. If you want to introduce that, we've kind of started the discussions somewhat.
Yeah, so we've pretty much touched base on it, but would you have any advice on a new consumer researcher partnership on how to effectively work together? Any specifics that have worked for you? Perhaps Christoph or Peter can answer that.
I suppose my advice would be is just to keep the communication channel happening, and you know, meet for lunch. That was great, and just talk. And it may not be about the grants or the specifics, but it just generally getting an idea of, you know, we move in different worlds, and to go and listen to some PhD students talk about, you know, what they're studying and what they're doing was just fantastic. And that was tangible things that I could understand and relate to. So that was great.
So I think, yeah, the person interaction is always, I think we're all a bit COVID damaged with all this remote and Zoom interactions. I think to have the possibility to meet and to have lunch and to interact with the group was really, really great. But given that there's a distance for Pete to come to Melbourne, I think we will also, of course, have Zoom and other means to communicate, just to keep the regular interactions going. But hopefully we can catch up in person at least a few times a year.
I know the topic today was really about grant success, but I think, of course, as somebody does apply for funding, I guess failure is inevitable at some stage. But I think as someone who has been involved in partnerships with consumers, that is something I think that is a real benefit that can go on even irrespective of what the outcome of the funding is. So I think that's one thing to really look up, and it can really convince you to kind of pursue with this, even in kind of failure of some grant applications. Anne and Anna, there's just one question as well here around, I guess these are crystal ball things, predictions of how do you feel funding bodies will evolve in this space in the future? Do you think that there's going to be, let's say, mandated requirements for consumer involvement, perhaps more heavily weighted? What's your thoughts on this?
I'm happy to start. In some ways, I think you should answer this question coming from the UK, because the UK is far ahead of us in this and has been mandating that sort of thing for a long time. You know, been involved in a recent UK grant, and of course you get reviewer feedback from all of your consumer reviewers, as well as getting feedback from the scientists that you have to respond to and rebut. So I think, you know, the pathway is clear before us in Australia because other people have trodden this before us. So yes, absolutely, I think it's going to be mandated. I think it's going to increasingly be in grant review criteria. It's just going to become more and more important, and I think it's still going to require quite a shift in Australia. I think it's not something that's perhaps well understood yet by a lot of researchers, but we're going to have to catch up fast because, yeah, I absolutely think this is going to just keep on becoming more important in the years to come.
Absolutely, I 100% agree, because if you look at the continuum of the history of it and the direction it's heading, with the weighting, the involvement, and the fact that it is mandatory in several of the big grants already, and in some of the private as well. One of them, the private organisation with, I think it was research at WeHire, they even suggested making a video and interviewing the consumer and, you know, talking about how they feel with the illness, you know, really the human aspect, because they're thinking of the outcomes. How many people can they help? Where will these drugs go? Who will benefit? How many Australians will live stronger, better, or not die of these diseases? So yeah, it's absolutely, I think, headed in that direction. So it can't be underestimated, for sure.
Christoph, any further thoughts on that? In terms of your own career, have you noticed that there's this increasing transition of the need for, you know, consumer involvement, perhaps in any funding bodies that are perhaps outside of NHMRC, anything like that you've seen?
Yeah, I can't really see that it's coming for something like the ARC, of course, but NHMRC 100% it will come across all the NHMRC schemes, and MRFF it's already pretty much mandatory. I'm really surprised that it's so different between different countries. So I'm looking at, so I know the UK is quite strong. I'm not sure what's happening in Germany. I don't think in Germany it's a very strong culture on consumer engagement, but I think in most of the countries it will come and be the medical sector at least will become mandatory rather sooner than later, I'm pretty sure.
That's probably a good way to finish this webinar today, is to really, I guess, the take-home message is if you don't get involved in consumer involvement pretty soon, you're probably going to be falling behind other people who are doing it very well, or perhaps you are going to face a grant application where there is a mandatory section and you won't have enough time to really involve people sufficiently to convince the reviewers who are going to be looking at your grant application. Let me finish, and on behalf of Patricia as my co-host today, and also the CCS CaRE committee, thank all the panel members today for your time, which you've really just volunteered for us today, this afternoon. Really appreciated your insight, and thanks again for, you know, sharing your thoughts and in the kind of context of grant applications. If anybody, of course, who is new to community involvement, community engagement, consumer involvement, feel free to get in touch with the CCS CaRE committee who can help facilitate the process for you. Or even if consumers who are online and would like to become involved, please do get in touch with us. We are a friendly bunch, I assure you, and we can hopefully, through facilitating that relationship, increase the research impact across all sorts of different diseases that are, of course, of relevance and interest to you. So on that note, thanks again, everyone, for joining in. Those who are watching the recording, hope you've enjoyed it. Take care, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you
Great
very
session.
much.
Thanks, everyone.
Stay well. Thanks.
Bye.